Hello everyone, and welcome to week 2 of Poll 205, Women in Politics. This week, I want to discuss some of the philosophical, theoretical, and cultural structures of feminism. Since many of these ideas will guide our discussion on how women and politics intersect throughout the semester, I want to begin class by exploring what feminism means to each of you. In this lecture, we're going to start by analyzing your responses to the survey that you took in week 1. Do you consider yourself a feminist? What sort of things or words come to mind when you think about feminism? How much do you agree with various feminist policy agendas? And what, if any, linkages can we find between political predispositions and attitudes about feminism? This semester, I'm teaching 2 sections of this course, so the data that you're about to see comes from students in both of my sections who took the survey. The first thing I was interested in was gauging your opinions about feminism broadly. When asked whether you considered yourself a feminist, about 70% or 42 students responded yes, and about 30% or 17 students responded no. Now, if you read Chapter 1 from Lawless and Fox last week, which I hope you did, you'll recall that these findings are pretty much in line with American public opinion in general. Most studies find that only about 25% of all Americans self-identify as a feminist. And if we look to page 8 of the text specifically, we see Americans between ages 18 and 19 are most likely to identify as feminists, about 41%. So it's not super surprising that we find about 70% of you embraced this label. But one thing I do want to focus on in particular is the number of all Americans, overall, who generally support feminism, just 25%. Why do you think that only a quarter of Americans identify as a feminist? Well, one reason is that the movement itself is surprisingly rather difficult to define, and you'll see that this is particularly true when we start talking about the different waves of feminism in the second part of this week's lecture. Another question on the survey asked you to list the words that come to mind when thinking about feminism. So here I've generated a word cloud of your text responses. The size of each word represents the number of times it was mentioned. Equality was mentioned 17 times, rights was mentioned 16 times, and empowerment was mentioned 11 times. So there's sizable agreement that feminism ostensibly exists to promote equality, right? But we do see some somewhat troubling words like radical, close-minded, and aggressive. So let's see what your responses looked like when asked to explain why you do or do not consider yourself a feminist. Here's a word cloud of responses when asked to explain why you do or don't consider yourself a feminist. And one major theme in particular across responses was the idea that feminism is not kind to men, which was the most mentioned response in this question. We also see a lot more negative descriptors like hypocritical, hate, and overpowering. So let's take a look at some specific responses in a little bit more detail to kind of figure out how people generally feel about feminism. Let's consider one student's explanation for why they do identify as a feminist. Quote, "I consider myself a feminist because I believe in equality for all, and feminism works to bridge gaps in equality between men and women. Feminism is something for people of every gender identity, sexuality, age, race, and socioeconomic background that believe that women deserve rights." And I think that that's a pretty succinct and articulate expression of what feminism stands for, right? Seeking political, economic, and social equality among the sexes. Let's consider a response from another student in explaining why they do not associate with the feminist label. They write, quote, "Even though I support equal rights for women, it has been my experience that the feminist movement is very divisive and creates a sense that you are either with us or you're against us, and I do not support that. I feel that it is hypocritical of a movement for equality." And the student's opinion really captures how a lot of people actually feel about feminism. Words like superior and exclusionary and radical particularly come to mind. And as we'll talk about later in this lecture, a lot of this resentment toward the label of feminism is really a backlash against the more radical second wave feminism. So one thing worth noting here is that the word or the label feminist is highly politicized. It represents a lot of different things to different people. And that's because over time, the feminist movement has stood for many different things and splintered into many different subgroups, and in fact has a history of being rather exclusionary, not only to men, but also to different intersectional identities of women. So one of the objectives of this class will be clarifying the boundaries of feminism, the historical origins of feminism, and helping make sense of why the word itself, the label, has such negative connotations. And, we'll be talking about to what extent are those stereotypes justified? What has the feminist movement done historically to kind of deserve this negative attention, as well as, how the media handles or covers women's movements, and to what extent are they to blame for framing the issue in a negative way to garner more attention. So setting aside the different feelings and expressions that come to mind when thinking about this label, let's move on to how the class rated and felt about different feminist policies. Because what's interesting here, as the student points out, of course, they agree with feminist ideologies, but they do not consider themselves one. And this is extraordinarily common. So let's look at the attitude breakdown. On the survey you took last week, I asked you to rate your level of agreement with 4 of the most salient or, nationally important feminist policy agendas. The right for paid leave, the right to have insurance companies cover contraceptives, the right to equal pay, and the right to a legal abortion. So although only about 70% of you identified as a feminist, overall, 92% of you agreed that there should be a right to paid leave, 90% agreed that insurance companies should cover contraceptives, 95% agreed that there should be equal pay among men and women, and 75% agreed that abortion should be legal in all or most cases. So when we're talking about basic feminist agendas, there was overwhelming support for these ideas among the class. But now I want to break down those numbers by strong agreement for the policy, and also by respondents who identified as feminist or not. And that's the data presented in this table here. So remember, when you were answering these questions, you had a variety of options. You could say you strongly agreed, you somewhat agreed, you felt indifferent, or you disagreed or strongly disagreed. So this table is just reporting those who strongly agreed. And we start to see some interesting gaps emerge here. Right off the bat, we notice that among those who did identify as feminist, there's generally stronger support for a given policy. We see that the most consensus on the issue of equal pay, and about 53% of those who do not identify as feminist strongly support equal pay, compared to about 76% of those who do identify as feminist. Now, notice how support declines when more actors are brought into the equation, such as what we think businesses or companies should do to accommodate the needs of women, or questions regarding pregnancy, abortion, and the unborn. Now, I'm not going to go over each of these percentages. I think you can look at the chart yourself, but what I do want you to notice is how strong support decreases among all groups, and especially how the gap widens between feminists and those who do not identify as feminist. This gap is most pronounced on the issue of abortion. 17% of those who didn't identify as a feminist strongly agreed that abortion should be legal in all or most cases, compared to 60% of those who did identify as feminist. So what I really want you to notice here again is that when we talk about feminism in broad terms of economic equality, equal pay, equal representation, almost everyone universally supports these ideas of baseline equality. However, the caveat, when we start talking about highly politicized issues like abortion and birth control, otherwise known as sexuality politics, then we start seeing these really polarized views on these issues. And again, it's not surprising considering that American politicians have been debating and regulating women's bodies in the government since, for a while. We'll talk more about that in the second part of the lecture. The distinction here is that feminism and women's issues are inherently multi-dimensional. And so, when we think about these terms and what they stand for, it's important to recognize that feminism, at least theoretically, is about achieving equality and autonomy across a variety of sectors of life and society for both men and women, and some of these can be rather controversial. And since we live in a representative democracy, we look to the government to secure and protect our civil rights and liberties. So when we, as democratic citizens, identify inequity or discrimination in our society, generally we charge the government with the responsibility of correcting these issues. And this is a point we're going to come back to over and over and over throughout this class. To what extent is it the government's responsibility to promote gender equality? Is it a societal issue? Is it a cultural issue? Is there anything the government can actually do and spend resources on to fix? So keep that in mind each week to week. To what extent is it the government's responsibility to fix these problems? So I was interested in learning to what extent each of you believe that various feminist policies ought to be government priorities. And I asked you 9 different normative questions. And I want to speak more to that, the fact of it being a normative question. That means we're talking about things that derive from societal norms. Normative questions gauge your opinion on whether or not you think something ought to be a certain way, or if it should be a certain way. And I'd like you to be especially aware of this, the difference between empirical and normative statements, and use this type of language in your reflection papers and your discussion board posts. So let me give you an example real quick. An empirical statement is a statement of fact. There are things that we know to be true. There are 435 members in the United States House of Representatives. That is a normative, data-driven fact. Donald Trump narrowly defeated Hillary Clinton in Wisconsin by 0.7 percentage points in 2016, right? That is a data-driven empirical fact. Normative statements, on the other hand, are more philosophical. They're more subjective. For instance, more women should be elected to Congress. The Electoral College ought to be dismantled, right? These are examples of normative statements about how the world ought to be, not necessarily how it is. And strong argumentation often involves making a clear normative statement about how things ought to be and supporting that viewpoint with various empirical evidence or facts. For instance, if you think that there should be more women in government, a normative assessment will maybe back that up with an empirical statement. Let's look at countries with strong women's representation and countries with no women's representation. And can we look at various elements of society to determine whether or not one is better than the other and the extent to which women's presence has anything to do for those differences? So just keep that in mind. Okay, the difference between normative and empirical statements. More on that throughout the weekly lectures. But back to the point. Here are the 9 normative questions I asked you, and like the previous graph, I've divided your responses between those of you who did and did not identify as feminist. Now, this data shows us the percentage of respondents who reported that each issue was extremely important for the government to prioritize. So none of the other responses are here. We're only looking at the people who said that this was extremely important. And what's the first thing that you notice about this graph? I'll give you a second to look it over. Go ahead and pause the video real quick if you'd like a moment to think it over in silence. The first thing that I notice are these significant gaps between the non-feminist and the feminist respondents. Look at the first question. Here you are asked to state how important it is that the government prioritize making abortions safe and legal. About 71% of respondents who identified as feminist reported that it was extremely important that the government prioritize safe and legal abortions. 17% of non-feminists agree that the issue was extremely important that the government prioritize it. So that's a huge ideological gap. And we see the most significant gaps in opinion between these two groups on issues relating to abortion, childcare, and paid leave. On the other hand, we see the strongest levels of agreement or consensus between the two groups on reducing domestic violence and sexual assault, reducing discrimination against women of color, and equal pay for equal work. And keep in mind, I want to overemphasize this. We're only looking at respondents who selected the extremely important option. Almost everyone reported that each of these issues, are important to some degree. But really, what I'm trying to illustrate here is that this graph is showing a distinct level of polarization on women's issues. Now, if you're unfamiliar, we're going to be since we're talking about women in politics, we'll be, talking about a variety of, government issues and political science terms. So if you're unfamiliar with the term polarization, that basically just refers to a divergence of political attitudes to ideological extremes. It's precisely why we see some groups report extremely high values on the issues, while other groups report relatively low values. They're polarized. The responses are to the polls. And most political science attributes our political ideology and partisanship as the primary culprit of polarizing attitudes. So to illustrate this, let's look at the feeling thermometer scores that you gave for the women's movement, feminism, and the hashtag #MeToo movement by your self-reported political ideology. Now remember, for the feeling thermometer, scores closer to 0 represent cold and unfavorable feelings, and scores closer to 100 represent warmer, more favorable feelings. And look at the almost perfectly linear trend that we see for support towards each of these various movements by political ideology. As we increase political ideology from those who identified as conservative, to moderate, to liberal, we see a gradual incline in support for each of these issues. Now let's talk a little bit about the sample characteristics so you can kind of wrap your head around the data and put it into perspective. Now, a total of 58 students took this survey, and of that 58, 11 or 19% identified as conservative, 16 or 27% identified as moderate, and 32 or 54% identified as liberal. So the sample here does possess some bias, considering more than half of the respondents fell into one of the categories. So in a way, liberal attitudes have been oversampled in the data that we're looking at. But for the sake of the exercise, we're going to go ahead and proceed with making some general inferences about the relationship between political ideology and attitudes about feminist policies. And I'll ask again, what is the one thing that you notice when looking at this graph? Go ahead and pause if you'd like a moment to think it over. The first thing that I notice is overwhelming favorability toward each of these terms, all of the terms, among liberals exclusively. The average thermometer rating for each of these terms for liberals was at or above 94%. And keep in mind, like the scale maxes out at 100, so you can't feel more favorable than 100. Moderates, as the name suggests, are situated right about in the middle of the road. And the conservatives in the sample, while still reporting remarkably favorable scores across the board, just don't feel as strongly about these issues compared to moderates or compared to liberals. So we have some pretty fascinating empirical evidence here that seems to suggest that there's a relationship between these attitudes and the political ideology that you ascribe to. And as a political scientist, we could even test the hypothesis that political ideology has a significant impact on attitudes about feminism? Is there a statistical relationship between these two variables? And that's exactly what I did. I took all of your responses, I built a regression model, I used various independent variables, so other explanatory factors that might explain your attitudes about feminism, like your age, your gender, your partisanship, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent, and I used each of those as predictors of your attitudes about feminism. And as the results suggest here, with over 97% confidence, your political ideology did in fact have a statistically significant role in shaping your feeling thermometer scores on feminism. And the coefficient here suggests for every 1 unit increase in your political ideology, so basically from from conservative to moderate to liberal, for each of those increases, there was over a 12-point increase in your feeling thermometer scores about feminism. And here's what the relationship looks like in a visual. And I'm not going to belabor the point here and try not to bore you too much in the week 1 lecture, but if this kind of stuff interests you, and you want to learn more about how to collect, analyze, and interpret your own data, just like how I've done here, I offer a course in the political science department called Research Methods in Politics and Government, which I strongly recommend you take, especially if you are a political science major. That course number is POL 361 in case you were interested. Okay, I just have to use this as a, obligatory moment to plug for my courses, of course. But at any rate, this is just a brief introduction into how we will explore things like partisanship, gender, race, and a myriad of other factors, how those influence our opinions not only about government, but social structures and the role of individuals within those structures. And using data collected from you guys in this class, we were able to replicate countless studies and show that political ideology has a significant impact on how we view the world and the people in it. And I'd encourage you to read Chapter 1 of the Lawless and Fox book if you have not done so already. It's always a good idea to read the book before the video lecture. That way you get a brief introduction to the week's agenda, and if anything's unclear, hopefully the video lecture will clarify that for you, and then you might want to try to read the book again to help get a crystal clear conceptualization of those terms, especially the Dolan book. As I mentioned in the week 1 video, the Dolan book can be a bit dense at times, so always give yourself the necessary time to read through that book. But at any rate, check out Chapter 1 of Lawless and Fox. I think you'll be surprised to find the many similarities between your responses here in this class and the nationally representative sample that's presented in the book. I think those are some really cool comparisons to be made there. In the next part of the lecture, I'm going to briefly overview the various waves of feminism in the United States and try to keep that one on the short side. But before moving on with the rest of the week 1 module, I generally will end my video lectures with some big questions, things to consider, things that you will see again in your reflection papers or your discussion board posts. So here are the big questions from the end of this lecture that I would like you to consider further. First, why do you think only 25% of Americans identify with the feminist label? Second, out of all of the feminist policy agendas presented in this lecture, which one do you think is most important and why? And what do we mean by most important? And third, why is political ideology such a strong predictor of attitudes towards the women's movement and feminism? All right, guys, that's it for part 1. I'm going to go ahead and end the video here to give you guys a little bit of a break. Please proceed with the rest of the module and stay tuned for the part 2 lecture. Thank you.